Hey everybody, getting ready to start the lecture videos for Unit 3 about Rome, Chapter 5, the Roman Republic, and Chapter 6, the Roman Empire. I'll also throw a little bit of Chapter 7 in there, but really all I'm going to talk about is the eventual fall, the end of the Roman Empire. Now, these next two videos will end up being a little bit longer. I don't expect you to sit through, an hour and 10 minutes in one go. If you want to break it up into smaller chunks, I mean, you do have to keep in mind that I'm going to be covering entire chapter lectures, something that might take us 2 weeks in class. I'm gonna do it here in a single video just to keep from having to record and process, multiple videos over one chapter. I'll just make one video and then you can watch it as you like. I mean, you might not even watch the entire video. As you're reading through the chapter notes, you might end up seeing something on the slide that doesn't read clearly. It made sense to me when I typed it up, but maybe it doesn't read that clearly to someone else. And you might just fast forward through the notes or through the video to where you see that note pop up on the slide and, stop there, listen to that, listen to my explanation, and maybe that'll make more sense. After that, it's still not clear, if you need further explanation, send me an email, make a comment in the Google Classroom, and I'll get back to you. You can jump into the Google Meet during my office hours and ask, for further explanation then. Other than that, just a reminder that we aren't going to have a semester exam for finals before we go into Christmas, with us being on remote learning. I think I explained it to some of the people that were in here right before the governor made the announcement that everybody was going back on remote learning. But we are just going to have a unit test over these next couple of chapters before we go on Christmas break, and then we'll pick up, where we should start when we come back in January. Fingers crossed, hoping that we will be able to come back in person January 4th when we come off Christmas break. But if we continue to be on remote at that point, we'll do the best we can. But if you have any questions, have any concerns, just get into contact with me and we'll see what we can do to get any problems taken care of. Now, with Chapter 5, what we're going to do, let me get everything switched over here to present. With Chapter 5, what we are doing is we are getting started talking about a new unit. We're talking about the Romans. Chapter 5 is about the Roman Republic. Chapter 6 will be about the Roman Empire. And then, like I said, I am going to pull a little bit out of Chapter 7 just to keep the Romans together. And I'll talk about the fall of the Roman Empire in just a couple of slides out of Chapter 7. Now, just like with every other unit that we've started, every new civilization, every new society that we talk about, I am going to start off talking about geography and how that ended up affecting how this civilization developed. Now, we don't know a lot about the prehistoric people that lived in Italy. We do know that by the time you get into the latter half of the 2nd millennium BC, that Indo-Europeans were starting to move into this region. I say by the Greeks and the Etruscans had settled in the peninsula by the 1st century BC. That's actually a misprint because we're talking about the Etruscans were there by the 6th century BC. Definitely, because that is when the Romans drive the Etruscans out of central Italy and establish the Republic of Rome. So that is a misprint. I will have to go back and I'll have to make a correction to that later, and I'll just post that correction, a note about that in the Google Classroom. In terms of how geography ended up influencing the development of the Roman civilization, you have to look at Italy compared to the different areas that we've talked about so far in class, whether when we talked about Mesopotamia, when we talked about Egypt, when we talked about the other civilizations of the Near East, when we talked about the development of the Greeks. I always look at geography. Well, Italy itself is a narrow peninsula. It's about 750 miles from north to south. And while it's not uniform, it's roughly about 120 miles wide across the peninsula, fairly uniformly all the way down. Now, of course, it is a little wider at the top as it links to the rest of mainland Europe, but it's more or less 100 to 120 miles wide east to west. Rome itself sits on the Tiber River, about 17 miles off of the west coast of the Italian peninsula. It gave the early settlers there access to the sea, but at the same time, it gave them a safe, defensible position from pirates, because when you think of pirates, and granted they weren't wearing eye patches and the funny hats and flying black flags, but as long as there have been coastal settlements in civilized times, there have been seafaring individuals that served as pirates. They were just the same way that you had bandits or robbers along the highways, the roads. You had pirates on the seas. They might attack other ships and take their cargo, or they might attack coastal settlements. Well, with Rome, the reason that the city developed where it was at is it was built, the city started off as 7 villages on top of this group of hills along the Tiber River. And like I said, being 17 miles inland, being settlements that started out built on hills, you have an elevated position, you can see upstream, you can see downstream. Any pirates that start to come downriver, come upriver from the coast, the people in those villages since they're in an elevated position, they're going to be able to see them coming well before they actually get there and get off of their boats and would possibly raid the villages. So it would give them time to set up a defense. As time goes on, because of the location of Rome, it was a natural crossing point in travel between, whether it was merchants or just anybody traveling north and south. Rome it's not exactly in the middle of the peninsula, but it's in a good central location. So travel north to south, considering that the peninsula is not extremely wide. I mean, if you want to consider that, and I'm not talking about like an army doing a forced march, you could easily, if you had to travel, you could probably cross the entirety of Italy east to west at the point where it's about 120 miles in less than a week. It wouldn't be a huge task to cover the 120 miles in 7 days or less. So it's in a good position north to south. It's in a good position inland. It provides some safety. And what happens is, because of the location of these 7 villages on the hilltops, as time goes on, more and more people end up settling in Rome because there's safety in numbers. The proximity of the villages to each other allows for quick and easy trade. More people settle because of safety in numbers, because of the location inland, but you have access to the sea, but you have protection from piracy. You have the Tiber River, which gives you a source of good running water, fresh water, and it's a good location for trade. So over time, more and more people end up settling in these various villages. Well, the communities that were built on these hilltops, as more and more people move, well, the communities expand. As they start to expand down into the valleys between the hills, and then this community is expanding down into the valley, and this one's expanding down into the other valley, you start to see where some of these villages, these towns start to grow together. And then these two grow together, and these three over here grow together. And then these villages that kind of morphed and grew into a town of multiple hills, then those different towns continue to add, because again, the larger a settlement is, the more safety that it provides, the better trade it provides. So those towns start to grow into each other, crossing the river even. And you end up with a situation where eventually those 7 different hilltop communities turn into an urban center, a city. The Greeks did have an influence. I mean, throughout Rome's history, in the Republican period, in the imperial period, the Romans borrowed very heavily, even though the Greeks didn't found Roman society. That was the Latin people of central Italy. The Greeks did settle some colonies in the southern part of the Italian peninsula, on the island of Sicily as well. And as Rome starts to take shape and the Roman people begin to expand outside of the little region around what becomes the city of Rome, as they move south, they come into contact with the Greeks. As they move north, they come into contact with the Etruscans, but the Etruscans are also expanding southward towards Rome as well. As they come in contact with the Greeks and the Etruscans, over time, continuous contact, they end up adopting different aspects of those cultures. And that's something the Romans would continue to do throughout history, is they are very adaptive and they were very practical as a society. If they saw something that worked for another culture, another society, and it could be adopted to the Roman way of life, they borrow it. And they wouldn't be shy about it. And they borrowed very heavily from the Greeks, because as the Roman Republic is starting to come into existence, starting to come into its own, that's when Greece is at its peak. That's when Greece is in its golden age. So the more they come into contact with the Greeks and they start to become part of the Greek world, they see all these different things that are part of Greek society that, work very well for the Greeks. So the early Romans end up adopting a lot of Greek society, a lot of Greek culture, whether it's religion, whether it's literature, whether it's, the formation of government, the concept of democracy. Those are all different things that they end up borrowing from the Greeks. You look at Roman mythology, and it's basically a carbon copy of Greek religion, Greek mythology. They just change some of the names, to give them a more Latin, more Roman sounding name. But, for, whether we're talking about Zeus, Jupiter, Ares, Mars, excuse me, Neptune, Poseidon, Mercury, Hermes, Hermes would be the Greek, Mercury would be the Roman version, Poseidon Greek, Neptune being the Roman version. They borrowed very heavily. They borrowed very heavily in terms of artistic tradition, whether it's sculpting, whether it's literature, poetry, the study of history, things of that nature. But they also borrowed very heavily from the Etruscans as well. They just borrowed different things from the Etruscans. Now, I didn't realize I didn't have the whole slide uncovered here. Also in terms of diet, the Greeks drank a lot of wine. They used, olives, were a very popular part of their diet. The written language, their alphabet that the Greeks had gotten from, or developed their own alphabet based off of the Phoenician alphabet. The Romans do the same thing. They develop the Latin written language based off of their interaction with the Greeks. And then from there, that's when they start borrowing aspects of Greek literature, writings about the Greek religion. They just basically translate it, adopt it into the Roman culture. And again, also sculpture, architecture, they borrow very heavily from the types, the styles that the Greeks used. And the Etruscans as well. One of the things that they borrowed from the Etruscans that a lot of people don't realize was actually not Greek. They attribute the wearing of togas, which was just a simple, very popular style of clothing. A lot of times they think that the Romans got that from the Greeks. They actually got togas from the Etruscans. The real development of Rome as an urban center was actually influenced by the Etruscans more than any other group. The Etruscans we don't know exactly where they came from. They did come from farther east. We can tell that they were influenced by some of the Near Eastern cultures that we've talked about in previous chapters. But by around 650 BC, they had expanded into northern Italy. They start to become a cultural and economic force, a political force in the northern half of the peninsula. Well, towards the bottom part of that northern half, they're going to come into contact with the Latin people and the settlement of Rome. Etruscan power peaks in the 6th century BC, which of course that would be the 500s BC. By the time you get to 480 BC, Etruscan power was declining to the point that the Romans had the upper hand, and they had already driven the Etruscans out of central Italy. By the time you get to 400 BC, they had very limited regions of influence in the very northern part of the peninsula. Like as you're getting into the the southern boundary of the Alps. Now, later on, that northern part of the Italian peninsula that was controlled by the Etruscans, and it ends up being invaded by the Gauls. The Gauls were the ancestors, the precursors to the Franks, which of course ends up establishing the Kingdom of France later on down the line. But again, that close proximity. Southern France is right there to the west of northern Italy. So that makes sense. Eventually, after being weakened by the Gauls even further, eventually as the Romans start to expand themselves, the Etruscans had moved south. I don't even know if you would say conquered the Romans, but they exerted control over the area that the Latin people, the people of Rome, lived in. So that was part of the Etruscan kingdom. Well, around 510 BC, that's when the Romans drive the Etruscans farther north. Then they end up losing more influence, more power, more land. They end up getting weakened even further by the Gauls invasion. And eventually, as the Romans start to expand north, eventually the Romans end up conquering the Etruscans, and they make that part of the Roman Republic as the Republic continues to grow. Now, looking at something else that they got from the Etruscans was the use of concrete, which becomes extremely important in Roman architecture. They might have borrowed style from the Greeks, but two important architectural things that they got from the Etruscans was the use of the arch and the use of concrete. Another term, the Etruscans were great engineers, great builders. The arch structurally is extremely useful and extremely strong, allowing for more elaborate designs, but maintaining strength. So the buildings, the things that they're designing don't collapse on itself, and concrete, cement helps hold that together. Another thing that the Romans got from the Etruscans were the way that the Etruscans built roads. Instead of just wearing paths between location A and location B, the Etruscans would actually go to a great deal of trouble to build roads to connect their urban settlements. And that's another thing that the Romans got from the Etruscans, is more of a focus on urban settlements, towns, cities. And that's something that the Romans are going to borrow from the Etruscans as they start to expand and build the Roman Republic. They will build a fortified location when they move into a new region. They will make a fortified military settlement. And once that place, once peace is settled, once the Romans gain control of that region and they're able to maintain the peace there, then you're going to start to see more people move. And of course, the safest location, especially on the frontier, would be right around those fortified military camps, those forts, because if there is an attack from barbarians, as the Romans referred to barbarians as anybody that wasn't Roman. It doesn't mean that they just wore furs and loincloths and they were all dirty savages. But the Romans referred to barbarians as anyone that was from outside the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire. But if you live on the frontier close to a Roman fort, and throughout the countryside, it comes under attack from barbarian raiders, what do? You pack up, you leave your farm, and you head towards the safety of the Roman fort. Well, most people build their settlements. They might have land away from the settlement, and that's where they farm, but they actually lived, on the frontier. They would build their first homes, their first settlements around, very close to the fort, so they didn't have far to run if they fell under attack. You get inside the fort, the doors are barred, and they have a strong defensive location. To connect these fortified settlements, the Romans ended up building roads a lot like the Etruscans did, and they went to a lot of trouble. I will talk a little bit more detail about how the Romans built arguably the best roads in the world, the best roads in history. There are some stretches that are a couple of 100 miles long of Roman roads that were built well back into the Republic era. And you still have, like the Appian Way, I will mention later on. It's a 300-mile stretch of road that was built thousands of years ago, before the birth of Christ. And, there's still 300-mile stretches still intact today. The reason that it's not longer than 300 miles is because as the area had modernized over time, they had to tear those roads up and put more modern roads in. But it's still just a testament to how well these roads were engineered, how well they were designed and built, that they lasted that long. I mean, around here in modern times, you pave a highway and within a couple of years, it's already starting to crack, it's starting to fall apart. It's going to have to be patched, or it's going to have to be completely repaved. And the Romans built roads before the birth of Christ that, you have hundreds of miles of roads that are still intact today. Now, this is the thing with early Rome, dating back to 753 BC. That's the year that historians, that scholars agree upon. They just agree upon the year 753. But, it might have been a few years before. It might have been a few years after that Rome technically was officially founded. But the Romans and all historians and scholars after that point, they agree that 753 was the year that the villages of Rome formed together into a city. Whether it was true or not, that's what's agreed upon. Archaeologists found proof that there were at least a collection of fishing villages. Like I said, 7 different villages on those 7 hilltops. But according to Roman legend, that 7 fishing villages wasn't magnificent enough for the greatest city. And Rome really was the greatest city in the ancient world at the height of the Republic, the height of the empire. So to say that Rome came from a couple of grubby little fishing villages, that's not majestic enough. That's not, it doesn't exude the power, the strength, the prestige of the city of Rome. So they just developed their own legend, their own story of how the city was founded by twins, Romulus and Remus, who were abandoned along the Tiber River, washed up in a basket on shore. Sounds a little bit like the story of Moses. And supposedly they were discovered by a she-wolf that had just had a litter of pups. And finding these human babies, she took them in with her to her den with her pups, and she raised Romulus and Remus. Now, of course, you would probably get the vision of, what was his name? Mowgli from Jungle Book, being raised in the jungle by animals. They probably wouldn't act like humans, but you have to, this is legend. You have to suspend your disbelief. But Romulus and Remus end up, once they get to adult age, deciding that they need to live around other humans as opposed to their wolf brothers and sisters. And they go off, they find, a little settlement, and they join it. And because of their leadership, more and more people start settling there, and it eventually grows into the city that would become Rome. I might come back and talk about the legend of Rome as opposed to the real way that it was founded, but I'll talk about the legend later. Archaeologists and historians have found proof of the existence of people that lived in the area that would become the city of Rome as far back as the 8th century BC. They just kind of agree, even though there weren't any written records, they just, at some point it was said 753 BC was the year that Rome was founded. But at that point, it wasn't actually a full-fledged city. It wasn't the greatest city in the world. It would have been a collection of fishing villages that over time would have grown together. Now, going through Roman historical records, it indicates that in the early period before the formation of the independent city, the Roman Republic, that Rome was ruled by 7 kings. 2 of the last 3 were Etruscans, so that would have overlapped with the time period that the Etruscans had pushed far enough south that they end up taking control of the region around Rome. It becomes part of their kingdom. So 2 of the last 3 Roman kings were Etruscan because that was a period of Etruscan occupation in the region. Now, again, like I said, the Romans end up borrowing a lot of things from the Etruscans, the same way that they borrowed from the Greeks, and I've already talked about those. The use of concrete, the building of roads, the use of the arch in their architecture. It's believed that the Etruscans were responsible for the first roadbed that would make up, I guess you would look at it like the main street of Rome as the settlement grew into a city. The first real road that wasn't just a dirt path. It's believed that the Etruscans are the ones that actually built that, and then the Romans would continue their tradition and their techniques of road building as they begin to expand their settlement, their republic. Like I said, the Latin alphabet was a modification primarily from the Greeks, but it did also have a little bit of influence from their interaction with the Etruscans. The Romans also associate the end of monarchy, the end of the period of kingship, and Etruscan domination with the story, which more than likely is a legend with little historical accuracy. But again, all of these legends, all these myths, there has to be a seed of truth that, kind of like a pearl. A pearl develops in an oyster based off of, a grain of sand, an irritant getting inside the shell, and then it builds up, this protective coating around that irritant so it doesn't bother, the muscle, the fleshy part inside. And a pearl ends up being the, product of that. And we use them for jewelry. They started off as a piece of debris or an irritant. Same thing with a lot of these myths and legends. There was probably a much smaller, less significant historical event that occurred, and a legend, a story starts to grow out of that. You could also look at the story of the rape of Lucretia as a piece of propaganda that would have been spread by the Romans to incite the Latin people to rise up and push the Etruscans out. In the story, Lucretia, who was the daughter of a Roman noble, she's raped by the son of an Etruscan king. When she goes home and she tells her family, she feels that what has happened to her, of course, it's not her fault, but in the story, what happens to her when she tells her family, she feels like she's brought disgrace upon her family, and she takes her own life. Then that motivates her family and family, relatives connected to that immediate family to start to gather allies, spread the story of what an Etruscan or an Etruscan royal has done to this Roman individual, and it makes the Roman nobility, their families, their servants rise up to drive these foreigners, to drive these Etruscans out of Roman land. And as a result, they form their own. They're not going to have a king because they associate that with Etruscan culture, and they end up establishing a democratic republic. Like I said, it's probably more myth and symbolic. Not to say that there weren't Roman individuals raped by Etruscans, but it's probably more symbolic. This story is more symbolic of the way the Romans perceived what the Etruscans were doing to the Roman people as a whole. The domination of the Romans by the Etruscans during this time period. It probably wasn't a patriotic uprising. It was probably just a power grab by the Roman nobility to increase their power and drive the Etruscans, who had not only challenged the Roman nobles' authority, they had overtaken authority from those Romans. So this, more so than a patriotic movement, this was probably just an attempt to reassert their power and drive their rivals, their enemies, out of the region. But the uprising and the establishment of the Roman Republic ends up taking place 510, 509 BC. The establishment of the Roman Republic is recorded in Roman history as 509 BC. And the way we look at it now, you have a period of Republican growth from 509 to about 264 BC. In politics and law, just like in a lot of other aspects of their culture, the Romans were extremely practical. New political institutions, whether we're talking about political offices, levels of the government, appointed positions, elected positions, popular assemblies where the people would vote for representatives, like our House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate. Institutions like that develop as problems arise, and the development of Roman democracy progresses based off of problems that the Romans faced. It's not like they sat down and they mapped out this elaborate government. They started out with a very simplistic government. And then as a new problem, pops up, well, the people that were in power would make some changes. They would add some new political positions. They would add a new popular assembly to address the issues, to address the problems that arise. In terms of executive power, the Romans had a term, a Latin term, imperium, that meant the right to command. Elected individuals or magistrates held imperium. The amount of imperium, or the amount of authority that you had, depended on what position you held. Certain positions outranked the others. Magistrates had supreme power, but they only held office for a limited time. You know, it's an aspect of modern democracy. You elect people to a position, and they have to run for re-election, or, you know, if they do a good job, they get re-elected. If they do a bad job, someone else gets elected and replaces them. If they, and the Romans also held their politicians accountable. If they did not do a good job, if they misappropriated funding, you know, if they committed crimes while in office, if they had imperium, they might have been untouchable, but as soon as they left office, they could be tried for crimes that they committed while they were in office. So Roman politicians were not untouchable. Now, of course, the more powerful, the more, you know, the wealthier that they were, you know, the harder it was to do anything about those crimes. But technically, it's just showing that there is some oversight, that technically they could be tried for crimes once they leave office. But you're going to have someone that would be willing to press charges against them and take them to court to charge them with crimes. That's where the problem would come in. But if they went to court, they could be put on trial. They could be found guilty for crimes they committed while in office. After the monarchy was overthrown, what they decided, instead of having a single leader, they would have two executives, two consuls. That was the name of the position. They would be elected annually. So there would be, you know, there would be an election for consulship every year. They were the head administrators of the government. They're the ones that led the army, similar to our elected president, who is our chief executive, our chief administrator, and also the commander-in-chief of the military forces. The thing about the consuls is they had the exact same authority. They were equals. You know, if the Senate proposed an idea, one consul could accept that, could vote in favor of it. The other consul could vote against it, and then nothing occurred. So you would have periods where if you had two consuls that didn't get along, say you had two consuls that were political rivals and they hated each other's guts, and well, if this guy votes for something, I'm not going to let him have a win, I'm going to vote against it. You might have a year where nothing got accomplished. If you had two consuls that were political allies, then a great deal might get accomplished. You know, whether it was good or bad, you know, it just depended on who the consuls were. And again, things develop over time. You know, this starts in 509, and then 366 BC, you have a new political office. Praetor ends up being created. This would rank beneath the consuls. And usually the way that it worked is if there were two consuls in the Republic, then as the praetor office was created, you might have two praetors, then it would expand to four praetors, and then you see down here, you know, by 197 BC, as the Republic grew, the number of praetors increased. You had 6 praetors responsible for different regions of the Republic by 197. You know, where the consuls were the chief administrators of the Roman Republican government, the praetors, that office is created to take some of the pressure, some of the work off of the consuls. The praetor had a couple of different realms of influence, but their primary duty was overseeing the justice system, the courts. That was their primary duty. Eventually, consuls and praetors, after they had served their terms, and that's another thing, you know, a consul might not be able to serve 2 consecutive years, but I might serve as consul this year. I couldn't run for re-election, but I could run the following year. And, you know, after a consul ends up holding office several times, and that's another thing, I might run for consul this year. I can't run for re-election the following year and serve 2 years in a row, but I could run for praetor this or next year. Then after serving as praetor for a year, I could run for consul again. So even if I'm not in that top position in the government, I could run for praetor. After a year as praetor, I could run for election as consul again. So some powerful individuals they might shift between the top two levels of the government. And if you have somebody that keeps doing that, keeps bouncing back and forth between these two very powerful positions, then they develop a great deal of influence. They develop a great deal of individual power and authority, more than likely wealth and influence. That influence is going to help keep getting them elected to different things, and that would eventually be a concern when you have some career politicians that keep serving in these high-ranking offices, alternating back and forth. The Senate starts to get worried. The popular assembly start to get worried, and eventually consuls and praetors that had served multiple terms, they start being sent as the Republic has expanded outside of the Italian peninsula. You have groups like the Senate being worried that those individual politicians might be growing too powerful. So they create the positions of proconsul and propraetor as administrators for frontier regions. They become governors of the provinces in the distant areas of the Roman Republic. And what it does is it gets those individuals out of the city of Rome. If they're serving as proconsul or propraetor, they can't be running for consul or praetor back in Rome. Now, being that far away from Rome, it might have left these powerful individuals open to kind of run those districts, those provinces, however they wanted. There was a lot of corruption, but the politicians back home in Rome felt that that was a worthwhile trade-off to get those powerful political figures out of the city of Rome itself, because they always feared if an individual became too powerful, they might assert themselves as a king and take over the entire government, where one person had all of the imperium. So it did lead to corruption in the provinces on the frontier, but they felt that it led to a smoother running of the Republic government back home. Not to say that there wasn't corruption within the Republican government. Again, as time would go on, sometimes even though the Romans hated the concept of a king, a lot like the Greeks didn't like the idea of a monarchy, there were times of strife, of problems. It might be a period of war, it might be a period of famine, or economic trouble in the Republic. The Senate would vote to appoint a dictator. Now, today we hear the word dictator and it carries a lot of negative attributes. Kind of like a tyrant in ancient Greece, a dictator in Rome, it was a political appointment, and it just meant that instead of having two consuls and the Senate or a popular assembly that made legislation, if they voted to appoint a dictator, they would choose the dictator. That person had to accept the appointment. They held absolute power for a 6-month time period. The consuls resigned, and the Senate basically became a group of advisors. That dictator would rule for 6 months. At the end of 6 months, the Senate or a popular assembly might vote to decide whether the dictator, whether they need to keep up this dictatorship, and if not, the dictator should step down. The consuls would retake their positions unless it was time for a new election to take place, and they would go back to the way things had been before. If the problem had not passed after 6 months, the Senate could vote to extend the dictatorship for another 6 months. It's not to say that you didn't have a dictator in place for a year, year and a half at a time, but generally 6 months usually was enough to get past whatever the major issue was that called for a vote of dictatorship. Some of the other less powerful administrative positions within the Republican government, quaestors, they were assistants to the consuls and the praetors. They assisted the consuls and praetors with day-to-day day-to-day administrative duties. They also paid more attention to finances. And I'm sorry, I just got an email here that I need to deal with a student. Aediles, they were in charge of supervising the public games, which were very important both in the Republican and the Imperial period. They also monitored the grain supplies in urban areas, specifically Rome. Rome's population eventually got so large that the farmland in the immediate area around Rome couldn't feed the population of the city itself. So that's another thing that became very important for the frontier territories where a lot of the agricultural products came from, is you had to monitor what the food supply was like in the city to make sure that famines didn't break out. Another thing is that a lot of people don't realize that the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, they had welfare programs. Poverty was very bad in the city of Rome specifically, so the government, they would have welfare programs where they gave free grain. If you made under a certain amount of money, they would, give free food. They would give grain to those people. Just one second here. Now, the censors were chosen every 5 years. They were responsible. I mean, to this day, our country has a census every 10 years. That's based off of the program that the Romans started up with the censors. They were chosen every 5 years. They were responsible for assessing the ages of the people that lived in the Republic, lived in the empire, and they looked at the property that people owned, and that information was used to see who needed to pay taxes, who needed to serve in the military, who was available for holding office. And then you had the Senate. The Senate was a council of 300 men of influence. At this point, that meant wealthy individuals, that once you were named to the Senate, you served until death. It was not a legislative body at this point. These people were advisors to the magistrates. The Senate didn't make law, but they had a very strong influence on the praetors and the consuls. The advice of the Senate was not to be taken lightly. The chief magistrates changed annually. Popular assemblies only met when they were called into session. The Senate, you served for life, and the Senate met continuously. It's one of these things where, there might be certain debates, certain votes, certain issues where the Senate, everybody came in and weighed in on an issue, but day to day, there were always at least a handful of senators that were coming in to discuss things, to carry out work and things like that. So the Senate met all the time. You might not have every member there every day, but the Senate was constantly in session, where the popular assembly, they might meet for 2 weeks at a time, but then they might not meet again for 6 months. The consul might have imperium, but they're only in power for a year, and then somebody else replaces them. So a senator, even if they didn't have legislative authority, they had a great deal of power and influence. Now, of all the assemblies, the Centuriate Assembly was the most important by far at this point in history. This was the popular assembly that basically made up, directed the Roman army, or at least voiced the concerns of the military in a political sense, to the Senate, to the consuls, to other popular assemblies. It was organized by class and wealth. Wealthiest citizens always had the most seats in the Centuriate Assembly. They were the ones that elected chief magistrates. They did have legislative authority. In terms of social organization, it was a male-dominated society. The republic ran like a family, and vice versa. The family ran like its own miniature state. The paterfamilias, the head of the family, ruled the family theoretically with unlimited power, unlimited imperium, or maius imperium. When the father died, his sons were then the head of their own families. But as long as your father was alive, he had power, he had influence over you, even as an adult. Families were grouped into clans, related families that descended from a common ancestor, usually somebody in that family line that had a significant amount of power or prestige. Roman society in general was divided into two groups. You had the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the upper class. They made about 25% of the Roman population. The plebeians made up the other 75%, and they were considered commoners. The patricians were considered upper class aristocracy because they were the descendants of the original senators as the republic takes shape, as they move out of the age of kings. The power came from wealth. They tended to own, those patrician families tended to own large agricultural estates in the countryside. They made up the ruling class. They're the one, for the longest time, patricians were the only ones that could run for political positions. They might be the only ones that could, for the longest time, they were also the only ones that held Senate positions. But eventually, Roman society is going to open up to where you could start life as a plebeian, but you might eventually be able to transition into a patrician class. Marrying into families could create that upward mobility for social or economic growth. 471 BC, the plebeian people, the commoners, were finally given representation with their own popular assembly, the plebeian council or the plebeian assembly. And I am going to pick up right here. I'm going to have to break this video up. I will pick up right here and finish that up here in just a little bit. Need to close everything out, stop presenting, and I will be posting another video here to finish up chapter 5 here soon.